So, there is no self. That's really all we're here to talk about. There is no self. There is no one inside. There's no person inside. It may very much feel that there is a person inside, which may make it very difficult to sit and hear someone say there is no self. But that's, in different ways, all we're going to talk about this weekend. There's no one inside. There is no self. There is no one making decisions. There's no one having experiences. There's no one having thoughts. There's no one performing actions. There's no one having feelings. All of these things just happen. Thinking happens with no thinking. Actions happen with no doer. Feelings happen with no one to feel the feelings. We could say that all these things I'm mentioning, they're all perceptions of different kinds. There's a perception of a thought, there's a perception of maybe an emotional feeling, colour of a scarf, pressure of a seat, sound of a voice, seeing a movement. These are all perceptions. What I'm suggesting is that the perception that there is a person, a central person for whom all those other perceptions happen, is just itself simply another perception. That's all. It has no more force and no more reality than any of the other perceptions. Its reality consists entirely of the fact that it's just a perception. Perception of movement, hearing sound, noticing colour, feeling texture, sound of a voice, sensation that all of those things are being experienced by someone solid in here. So the suggestion from here is simply that final sense that all of the other perceptions are being experienced by someone is in itself just another perception. It's just a passing, let's call it a thought feeling. It's not really accurate to call it just a thought, because for most of us, the sense that this is solid is much more than just a thought. It's not really accurate just to call it a feeling either. Is it a feeling, a sensation, a thought? We need a new word really, but let's call it a kind of thought feeling or feeling thought. It can be very powerful. And the suggestion here is that is just another sensation, another perception. But it can be so powerful, we could say it is, well, we could certainly say it is one of the greatest addictions, the addiction to the sense of self. Some might say it is the greatest addiction of all and the most difficult addiction to shed. The addiction to the sense that there is a doer in here, that there is a person in here. And all the things that go with that. And all the things that go with that include almost everything that most of us feel are important. Which is why, if the sense of self drops away, if the sense of self is seen through, if it suddenly becomes apparent, as it can be, that this actually is entirely empty and not entirely full, it can be such a shock. It can be such a shock and such a challenge. It can challenge everything. Not everything, but almost everything. Because almost everything that most of us tend to hold as important aggregate around or accrete around that sense that there's a person in here. A person who is choosing things, a person who is responsible, a person who has a past that they may be responsible for, a future that they're moving towards, perhaps a person who's on a path, perhaps, most importantly for some of us, a person who is on a meaningful path, a person who is on a journey somewhere. All of those things may seem extremely important for us, and they all accrete around, they all attach to that sense that there is a person in here. When the sense of the person collapses or dissolves, all those other things dissolve as well. Time dissolves, space dissolves, responsibility dissolves, choice dissolves. The idea of a free individual freely choosing their life, it just dissolves. Meaning dissolves. The sense that we are on a path to somewhere dissolves. A path requires at least time, but a path requires space and time. So if the sense of self dissolves and the sense of time dissolves, the sense of meaning and being on a path has to dissolve. Because there can't be a path if there is no time for a path to unfold in. There can't be meaning if we're not going anywhere. This is already it. This is already it. The meaning of everything, every possible meaning that could possibly be sought and found is already this. So that's why it can be such a shock if the emptiness which is really here is suddenly seen. It's often reported as a tremendous shock. And it blows everything apart. It blows every conception, every philosophical idea, every notion of self-improvement. Just blows it all apart. And what's it leave? Just leaves this. It leaves nothing and everything. It leaves nothing out of which this arises. So another way of, I started this introductory talk, which may go on for 10 minutes, it may go on for an hour and a half, who knows, I hope it's not an hour and a half, but I started this introductory talk by saying, there is no one. I could just as easily have started it, sometimes I do start, by saying this is it. It's really saying exactly the same thing. This is it. What do I mean by this is it? Just this is the entirety of existence, whatever is happening. What does existence consist of? Existence consists of whatever perceptions are arising. And we could say, and the nothing from which those perceptions are arising. And we have to add, because we seem to have suddenly sprung into an astonishingly dualistic world for an evening on non-duality, where suddenly there's two things, there's nothing and there's everything. There is the nothing from which everything arises and the everything which arises from it, so we have to immediately add, and they're the same thing. They seem to be the same thing. It's not non-duality, not two, not nothing and everything, but nothing and everything which are the same thing. In other words, if we're used to thinking in these terms, and we may well be, the absolute and the relative. There's the absolute and the relative, but they're not different. They are the same. The absolute is the relative, expressing itself as the relative. That T-shirt is the absolute expressing itself as a T-shirt. The sounds of this voice is the absolute expressing itself as the sounds of this voice. That hand to the chin is the absolute expressing itself as the hand to the chin. The absolute is the relative. The relative is the absolute. How can that be seen? How can it be known? It can't be seen and it can't be known as long as there's somebody in here looking for it. That's the irony. That's the paradox. As long as there's someone in here looking for the secret, looking for the absolute, looking for oneness, then the secret, the absolute, oneness cannot be seen. When there's no one in here looking for oneness, then oneness is seen. When there's no one in here looking for the secret reveals itself, and it's realised that there never was a secret. It isn't a secret. There is no secret. We could equally say, this is the secret. This is already the secret. It's so obvious, isn't it? There could be nothing more obvious than this. What could be more obvious than the fact that this is apparently happening? It can't be anything more obvious than this, and yet we think there's some sort of secret to discover. The secret to discover is there is no secret. That is the secret. The absolute and the relative are one. There was never anything to search for. Now there are anything can happen. There are no rules, but there are some common phenomena that are quite often reported. If there is a sudden seeing of this, if there's a sudden seeing through the person, if the sense of solidity here that makes up the person suddenly collapses. I've mentioned one of those already, and it can be shock. My God, what? It's just that sense of shock. Another phenomena that is quite often reported on is laughter. It doesn't always happen, but quite often, if the sense of solidity that seems to be the person collapses, there's often a lot of laughter, because it's suddenly seen as such a joke. It is such a joke that there never was a secret. Or there is a secret, but the secret is there never was a secret. It can provoke a lot of laughter, particularly if the personal history of the one who collapses, the one who is a solid person, and suddenly there's a collapse of that, and there's just emptiness, the seeing of emptiness, and the seeing of the fullness of this that flows out of emptiness and is the same as emptiness. Well, particularly if the one who was there in the story of time a few seconds before and now is no longer there, particularly if that person had been a spiritual seeker, perhaps for many years, perhaps had spent time in the Himalayas, sitting at the feet of gurus, eating rice and dal, getting dysentery and so forth, repeating mantras, learning mudras, chanting, saying their japa. Beautiful framed photograph of the guru on the wall, lighting candles to the guru. Particularly, not only in this case, but particularly if the person who was there a second ago and collapses was a spiritual seeker, there can be a lot of laughter, because it just seems like such a joke. All those years of searching for a secret out there, all those years of seeking, and suddenly the realisation that there was never anything to seek for, that what we were seeking out there is closer to me than I am to myself. It was always there. We were always seeking the beloved out there, and the beloved was always right here. And part of the laughter, there's not always laughter, of course, but often there is, and part of that laughter is the kind of that sudden understanding that for the one who feels like a person, and who feels that, well, we know what that feeling of being a person is like. It's like things aren't quite right. They may be nearly right, but they're not quite right, because there's always that feeling of separation. Maybe even when things are going very well, there's still that feeling of separation, that feeling of contraction, that feeling which makes us dissatisfied. And it's entirely sensible. It's almost unavoidable that the one who feels separate, the one who feels dissatisfied, is going to feel, well, I want to do something about this. And there are two possibilities. There can only be two possibilities. If I'm unhappy, if I'm dissatisfied, if I don't feel quite right, either reality out there needs to be changed. I need to get a better car, a better job, a more satisfying job, get a divorce and get a new partner, build a house extension, heated swimming pool, become a priest and do good work and save souls for God, whatever it might be. But the logic is, there's a problem here. I feel dissatisfied. I don't feel quite right in my own skin. There's a problem to be solved. There's only two possibilities. Either I fix stuff out there, or I fix stuff in here. It's got to be one or the other, or maybe it's both. So if the divorce and the new partner doesn't work, the new car doesn't work, giving up my job as a financier and becoming a Catholic priest so I can do good work doesn't work. If none of that stuff out there works, then obviously it's in here I need to fix the problem. So maybe psychotherapy, meditation, following the Guru, seeking spiritual enlightenment. 2 years in a Zen monastery might fix it, who knows? But it's got to be one or the other. I mean, it's a really sensible and obvious way to go about trying to resolve what we could call the core problem of existence. I don't feel quite okay with what is because of that feeling of separation. So I need to fix something out there, or I need to fix something in here, or I need to do both. Maybe it's a Ferrari and 3 more years of psychoanalysis that might fix it, who knows? And if this that believes that suddenly collapses after 30, 40, 50 years maybe of seeking, and there's laughter, sometimes what that laughter is about is just that sudden realisation that that was always impossible because there never was an out there and an in here. And in a sense, that was the whole problem. That perception that there's an out there and an in here, in a way, is the problem. And when that collapses, and I mean collapses on an energetic level, I don't mean when there's a kind of new thought about it or a new understanding of a bit of Advaita philosophy or something. I mean, when that actually collapses on an energetic level in a sudden way, if there's laughter, that might be partly what that laughter's about. It is such a joke. It's such a joke that it seems so obvious that I needed to fix what was in here or what's out there, or both, and there was never any of that going on. There never was an out there and an in here to be fixed. There was always just this. There was always just this. Just whatever's happening. It's never not this, is it? I mean, in a way, I have come all the way from England. I have been brought all the way from England to sit here and state what colloquially in England we call the bleeding obvious. There is justice. Isn't that the most obvious thing in a way? In a way that's really challenging. Like, what do you mean there's justice? I've got a past, I have a future. There's time, I move through time. Maybe I dedicate my life to something very meaningful in the future to which I'm aiming at. And on that level, for someone to sit here and say, but there's just this, it may sound like an affront, but in another way, isn't it the most obvious thing that anyone could say? There is just this. What else is there? Is there a past? Of course there's a past, but how can that exist simply as a thought in this? Isn't that obvious? And what can the past possibly consist of, other than a thought in this, arising in this? Is there a future? Of course there's a future. I'm hoping for breakfast tomorrow morning. I've even already planned where I'm going to go for breakfast. So of course there's a future. Where does that future exist? Only in this, only as a thought in this. So in a sense, for somebody to say, there is only this. There is no past. There is no future. There is just this. In one sense, that's quite a shocking thing to say. But in another sense, it's a statement of the obvious. We could equally say there is no past, there is no future. Or of course there's a past, of course there's a future. It's not contradictory. It may sound contradictory. It's not even really a paradox. There is no past, there is no future, because there is just this. And in this, thoughts of past and future arise. It's the only excuse me. It's tree pollen time. I went out into the tear garden yesterday. Within about a minute I realised it's tree pollen time, that wonderful time of the year for hay fever sufferers. So is there time? Of course there's time. There's memory sitting here in this room. There's thoughts about the future maybe. Is there time? Of course there isn't time. How can there be time? It's just this. Where's the time in this? There's just this in which experience and thoughts of time arise. Stories of meaning arise. Stories of paths arise. Stories of separation arise. Responsibility, free will, choice. All arising in this. All equally and joyously meaningless. The end of seeking is to realise there was nothing ever to seek. The goal of path is to realise there was never any path to walk. The meaning of life is there is no meaning to life. There's just this. There doesn't need to be a meaning to life. This is already too full to have any space for meaning. Can't be any meaning because there's no space for it to get in, because this is already so completely full. I mean, when I say there's no meaning to life, I'm not saying it in a kind of miserablest existential sense. There's no meaning to life, so we might as well shoot ourselves. There's no meaning to life because there doesn't need to be. Life is its own meaning. Life is already so full. This is already so vibrant and full. It doesn't need meaning added to it. I often say at this point in a talk, pointing to the flowers that are conveniently to my right, the flower doesn't need any meaning to be a perfect flower. What meaning could add more perfection to these flowers than they already have? That they are flowers searching for God or the meaning of life or for enlightenment. I don't know what an enlightened flower would be like. The flowers don't need any meaning to be perfectly satisfactory flowers. Let's put it no higher than that, to be perfectly satisfactory flowers. We don't need a meaning to be perfectly satisfactory individuals, humans, whatever we see ourselves as. We might have bought into a story that we need meaning, which is quite convenient for kind of raising our levels of neurosis, but it's an unnecessary add-on. I mean, there's already perfection sitting here. It can't be added to by giving it meaning. Perfection can't be made more perfect by giving it meaning. The meaning of a flower is a flower. The meaning of Giorgio is Giorgio. The meaning of Richard is Richard. Nothing really more to be said about it, although we find lots more to be said about it. Some of it very entertaining, some of it very deep, some of it very fascinating, and all of it nonsense. And still, we're left with this, just this chink of a ring against the glass. The sound of a cough from somebody suffering from tree-induced hay fever who spent too long in the Tiergarten this afternoon. A little laugh, movement of a foot. Reflection in a window. Colour on a wall. Just this. Nothing else needed. People sometimes ask me what it's like, and the only possible answer to that is, well, it's not like anything. Or if you like, say, well, it's like everything. But the only thing I ever found I could add to that, which made any sense, is, well, it's probably a bit more relaxing. What's it like? Well, at least it's a little bit relaxing. All that searching and neurosis and looking for meaning and following paths, it can be very, very entertaining. There's no doubt about that. It can be hugely entertaining, but it can also be very stressful. It's quite difficult to relax when every second, precious minute, precious hour of every precious day, we could be, and for many of us we should be, improving ourselves along the path of meaning and evolution. I mean, that can be very entertaining, but it sure as hell isn't necessarily very relaxing. So what's it like to lose all that? What's it like to lose the sense that there's anyone in here who needs to do anything, who needs to go anywhere, who needs to achieve anything, who needs to find out what the meaning of their life is? That's all I can say is, well, I don't know, but at least it's likely to be a bit relaxing. I was reading a book recently about a Dzogchen, Tibetan Dzogchen master, and the English Buddhist who did the translation, a guy called Keith Dowman, wrote a very good introduction to it, and almost the last line of the introduction was relaxation is the key to Buddhahood right here, right now. I love that. It's great. I mean, I suppose I could say it's a little bit pompous, the key to Buddhahood, but, it's lovely. And it's real, it's kind of true. I don't usually use the word truth. True. I already regret just having used it now, but never mind, it's out. There's something right about that. There is something, I won't say it's true, I'll just say it's right. There is something right about that. The key to Buddhahood right here, right now. Relaxation is that key. That's not a path, by the way. There's no suggestion here that we now embark on the path of relaxation. But if relaxation happens, it's a great blessing.
But you mean you cannot do anything for it to relax deeper?
It's much, much worse than that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying there is no one in there. I'm not saying you cannot do anything to relax. I'm saying there is no one. To say that you can do nothing to relax would be to suggest that there is a person there who is powerless to take control of their own fate, where relaxation is concerned. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying there's a powerless person there. No, not at all. I'm just saying there's no one there who's either powerless or powerful. There's no one there. It's emptiness there. And relaxation may occur. It may occur. And if relaxation occurs, it may be seen as a great blessing. It doesn't sound very dramatic, relaxation, but it's a great blessing. There are quite a few stories around of individuals where this has been seen maybe, quite suddenly. And what's happened after that might be a sitting around on a park bench looking at the horizon for about 2 years. I don't know why it's always 2 years. I don't mean that always happens. But where this story is reported for different individuals, I don't know what the logic of that is, that it's like 2 years rather than 6 months or 5 years. But I've come across several cases of that in the literature, as they say. And that kind of makes sense. Profound relaxation. Why not sit on a park bench and look at the horizon for 2 years? If you don't have to do anything else, why not? So that's what I'm saying. If relaxation happens, that's a great blessing. I'm not saying there is nothing you can do to relax.
I saw an interview with you on Conscious TV, and you said you tried LSD, for example,
A very long time ago, I want to say. Yeah.
Okay.
And
the perception now from the reality, is it different to your trips? Or
yeah,
is it
totally.
similar?
Completely different.
Completely different?
Completely
Okay.
different. No
so
connection.
It's an illusion with these trips, to see the reality through these trips.
All I'd say about LSD is what it can open up is what I'll call normal reality, or reality as it is usually taken for granted, and may have been taken for granted for 15, 20, 30, 40 years, depending on when the LSD trip is taken. All I'd say about LSD is that what it can reveal is that ordinary reality is simply one version of reality. Reality as it exists, as it's experienced, it's just an interaction between something. We might as well call it energy, because we might as well use a word. Something and brain chemistry, and the way our sensory organs are constructed. That's all reality consists of. So if you take an hallucinogenic drug, it can reveal that. That's all. It can reveal that reality is simply a kind of construct. But apart from that, no, I wouldn't say there's any connection between an LSD trip and what we're talking about here. Well, I'd add to that even a split second of awakening, and it may be a split second, it often is, even a split second of awakening can also reveal that that's a construct, and this is a construct. So there's a kind of parallel there. The sense of self, the sense of person, the sense of the one who acts, the one who takes action in the world is a construct. It's not a mental construct, it's not an emotional construct, it's not a feeling construct, it's like a combination of all of those. We could go straight back to the simplicity of the Buddha's statement. Actions there are, but no doer thereof. I mean, that's another way I could have started this talk, and it would sum up the entire weekend. I don't know what we're going to talk about over this weekend. I don't know where we might go. Might go into the realms of psychotherapy or who knows what. I don't know. But it could all be summed up in that statement of the Buddha. Actions there are, but no doer thereof. And we could say that about any perception. Hearing there is, but no hearer thereof. Speaking there is, but no speaker thereof. Feeling there is, but no feeler thereof. That sums it up beautifully. So I don't know what your thoughts and feelings about this might be, but I think it's very common that if we set out on a spiritual path, for example, a spiritual path, it's usually with, on some level, the hope and the expectation that there is something to be gained from that. And we might not think of it quite in that way because that's a bit ignoble, isn't it? I mean, that's not very spiritual to think I might get something out of this, but nevertheless, I think usually there's a kind of impulse and motivation there. You know, most of us, if we work for 9 months in order to save up the airfare for India so that we can go and sit uncomfortably in the Himalayas and be taught mantras by our guru, for most of us there's the thought or the hope that we might get something out of it. There is something to be gained, in other words. And part of the revelation, if this collapses, and again it might also explain some of the laughter which sometimes occurs, is the realisation there was never anything to be gained, there was something to be lost. The end of all that seeking, whether it's flying to India and climbing up into the Himalayas or whatever it might be, it doesn't matter. But the end of all that seeking was always, the only possibility was that the realisation there was never anything to be gained, but there was something to be lost. And what was to be lost was simply the sense of I. And can I just add one thing there? Because, and we might talk about this later over the weekend, but there can be so much confusion over this use of the word I. When I say the loss of a sense of I do not mean loss of the ego as it's usually understood in psychological terms. As in, we should become less egotistical. Before the throat gets me.
Were you a spiritual seeker before it happened to you?
You bet. 30 years.
Yeah, that's always confusing me, because all the people who are talking about that, they say this can't be reached. There's no preparation for it, it just happened. But everyone was a spiritual seeker before.
No, it's not true. No, there's lots of people talking about this. They had no history of spiritual seeking at all. It just happened. Just one moment they were there, the next moment they weren't. One moment there's somebody riding down a country lane on a bicycle, the next moment there's simply riding down a country lane on a bicycle and nobody doing it. And that's all we're talking about. And there are many reports where that's happened with no spiritual seeking, no prior knowledge at all. There can be a problem with that, because if there's no understanding of this, no spiritual seeking, no knowledge whatsoever, then the shock of that happening can often be interpreted by the one for whom it's happened as psychosis, possible psychosis. So it can be quite disturbing, and there are quite a lot of reports like that. A few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was giving a talk in Bonn, and somebody came all the way from Bern in Switzerland. He wasn't free to come to the talks. He just came all the way from Bern just for the afternoon so he could have a cup of tea with me and talk to me. He was a medical doctor. He was a medical professor in a university. And he was in the process of beautiful, lovely awakening. And the reason he wanted to come to talk to me was he just wanted reassurance that he wasn't becoming psychotic. He didn't feel he was becoming psychotic. He wasn't unhappy, absolutely the reverse. But he knew enough about psychosis to be a little bit concerned. So he just wanted reassurance. there's been a research paper published fairly recently by someone who sort of looked into many cases. It makes it sound like a disease. It is a disease in a way. Someone who's been researching many cases where that sense of self has been lost. And he talks about several cases, quite a lot of cases, where there was no prior understanding whatsoever. So when it happened, there's no kind of immediate, oh, so that's what it is. And he says in a lot of those cases, the people, wonder whether it's the beginnings of psychosis. And he does say this in a very absolute way, actually. He says, quite a lot of individuals for whom it happened like that, they seek advice or help from mental health professionals. He said in every single case they report that the mental health practitioner was of no help whatsoever because they didn't understand. And he says more or less in every case the mental health practitioner, they see this as psychosis, accept that the person experiencing it, excuse the conventional language, but the person experiencing it isn't unhappy. And that's what puzzles the mental health practitioners. They can't quite fit this in because to them it seems to be psychotic. I mean, to them, if you go to a mental health practitioner in normal circumstances, I've lost the sense of myself, there doesn't seem to be anybody here, there doesn't seem to be a person here, they're going to start thinking, disassociation, psychosis, da 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 da. But usually that report will go along with a lot of feelings of unhappiness. So the things that puzzles the mental health practitioner about this is that's psychosis, but the person isn't unhappy. In fact, they seem quite happy, very happy actually. So it can certainly happen out of the blue with no meditation, no spiritual seeking, no spending time with gurus, no Zen retreats. Many reports of that. The only thing I'd add to that is I sometimes feel that where there has been a history of spiritual seeking, as there was here, and there is in many cases, of course, so there's a kind of, maybe that sort of understanding as well, maybe it's more likely to lead to that individual talking about it, giving talks about it, writing about it, making YouTube videos about it. So maybe that creates this sense that you're talking about, that there's always that spiritual search beforehand. There isn't. In a sense also, maybe we can, I haven't talked about relaxation, maybe we can relax about whether spiritual seeking goes on or doesn't, in the recognition that what happens, happens. Absolutely, 100%, absolute rule. So if spiritual seeking happens, it happens. Spiritual seeking doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. We don't need to be concerned about it. I mean, on a psychological level, we could say, well, what that means is if an impulse arises that magnetises us towards a 6 month Zen retreat, then it's quite likely that'll happen. It's not certain, but it's quite likely. And if that impulse doesn't arise, it's probable that it won't happen. In either case, it has nothing to do with who we think we are. It's just an impulse. Where does it arise from? It arises from the same place everything arises from. It arises from nothing. An impulse to go on a Zen retreat arises. Or an impulse to go to the bar arises. They both arise from the same place. They both arise out of nothing and they fall away back into nothing. And neither has anything to do with who we think we are if we're living in separation. If we think we are the one who's making that decision, or that there is a decision to be made even. Zen happens or it doesn't. Drinking beer happens or it doesn't. So maybe it's possible to relax. Relax into Zen, relax into drinking beer. If you're lucky, maybe both. A bit of Zen, a litre of beer, a bit more Zen, whatever.
the doer has gone and you realize there's nobody who does anything, is it a permanent state, or does it want to come back some in a moment again, or is it permanent? You lost the identification, and does it come back sometime? Or?
It's a tricky question to answer for several reasons. The first is, I would say, it's not a state. So is it a permanent state? In a way, it's not a state. This is one of the reasons that no matter how much we struggle with the mind, we cannot get a hold of what we're talking about here, which is, again, one of the reasons there can be both shock and laughter when this is finally seen. And there's a sudden understanding, of course, the mind could never have got this. And there are people who study Advaita for 40 years, who understand Advaita probably more than anybody else on the planet, but they haven't got this. And if there's one split second of seeing, there's that realization as to why. So it's not a state. So whether the question, is it a permanent or an impermanent state, kind of collapses in a way. However, I won't just leave it there because that might be a bit frustrating. Another thing we could say is, of course, everything is impermanent. Everything in the relative world is impermanent. All experience, in a way, that is one of the most obvious facts of existence. That everything's impermanent. There's nothing permanent. Most things only last in the story of time a few seconds. How long does a cup of tea last? Maybe a minute or two. How long does a thought last? Maybe a few seconds. Somebody name a famous building in Berlin. What's a famous building in Berlin?
Brandenburg Gate.
The what? The Brandenburg Gate. How long does the Brandenburg Gate last? Well, how long are you aware of it for? How long do you look at it? Brandenburg Gate probably only lasts a few seconds. Maybe if you're a very interested tourist, it might last up to a minute or two, and if you're trying to take a very good photograph of it, 3 or 4 minutes. Everything's impermanent. Everything is in this constant state of flux and change. I mean, again, the Buddhists are very, very good at seeing that. It's one of the core teachings of Buddhism that everything's impermanent. So, in a way, again, in a way, I mean, it's a perfectly sensible question. It's a question many people ask. It's a very obvious question in a way, and in a sense, it collapses because what we're talking about isn't a state, and because nothing is permanent. However, taking the question in the spirit in which I think you probably asked it, I'll give a different answer. And the answer that I'll give is anything's possible, but my feeling is it's fairly unlikely that once this is seen, there can be ever a return to that. Well, what's referred to in the literature as that kind of illusion, that living in the illusion that there is a self. That's my sense. It's unlikely that there can be a return to that. Because it is a kind of revelation. And I mean, once something has been revealed, it's kind of difficult for it to be unrevealed again. So that's my sense. That research I referred to already, which kind of looked in depth at about 50 cases. 50 cases. Okay, so this is like malaria. So it looked at 50 examples, let's say, in great detail, and quite a lot more, I think something like about 150 other examples in less detail. And I mean, I don't know how much this research is to be trusted. I mean, I'm not particularly kind of saying, it's interesting, that's what I'd say. He seemed to feel that in the individuals he'd interviewed, there were 1 or 2, very few cases where there seemed to have been a kind of return to a more, let's call it a more dualistic way of being. And there even seems to be, I mean, I won't bang on about this because, but I'll just mention it. There even seems to be one or two cases where he felt there'd been like a kind of a deliberate return, like the individual had made themselves go back into a dual, let's call it a state. It isn't a state, but just for the sake of, we've got to use language, had kind of made themselves go back into a dual state because there was something about that kind of non-dual space which was too threatening to some aspect of their life. I don't know what to make of that, I'm just reporting on it. But I think by and large, once this has been seen, it's been, once this is seen, it's seen. There's not much chance of kind of going back from that.
Well, you told us there's no possibility to achieve this experience of awakening or to force it. But if we take a population of about, let's say, 100,000 people, and you pick out the 3 or 4 or 10 or 20 people who have this experience of being awake, would you say these people have something in common? I mean, beyond this experience.
Oh. And it may not be...
It's just by chance.
It gets so difficult to talk about this. First, I'd say we've no way of knowing whether, I can't remember the figures we've no way of knowing whether it's, if we take 1,000 people, we've no way, or 10,000, we've no way of knowing whether it's 4 or 10 or 50 or 100. We have no way of knowing, because I think there are many cases where this happens and individuals learn very quickly not to talk about it. If they're not in a country, it's fine to talk about it here, but if it just happens, there's not much understanding of it in the people around you, particularly your beloved family. I mean, there are certainly cases where your beloved family might well start ringing up a psychiatrist and looking for mental health help if you start talking about this. And may feel very threatened by it. So there are certainly cases where people do not communicate about this, or maybe they try once and then they learn that, no, you don't talk about this. So we can't know.
But do you have an idea or impression that there might be some qualities that unify these people?
No.
No.
Well, I have an idea or an impression that there are. I'm not saying no. I don't have an opinion about that. I have the opinion that there are no common qualities that yeah. So the answer to the question is, it seems it can't be known. I mean, like many other things. There are many, many unknowables. We spend a great deal of time discussing things which simply can't be known, where really all we can utter are superstitious beliefs about stuff that is absolutely unknowable. So it can't be known, but my impression, my guess is no, there's no common characteristic. If there was a common characteristic, we'd be able to develop it. We could become rich. We could run workshops on how to develop that characteristic. There are many, many people who do run workshops on how to develop that magic characteristic. Be still inside. Be silent. Quieten your thoughts. Be in the now. Be present. Be mindful. Don't just drink the water. Drink the water mindfully. Here I am, drinking the water mindfully. I mean, obviously many, many people will develop lots of practices, processes, workshops, etc., 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 based on that idea that there is a common characteristic, or there are some common characteristics that at least make this more likely. Be still, be silent, be present, be here now, don't have too many thoughts. That sums a lot of it up. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. But if you don't like that, well, try it. Doesn't matter. It's fine. And I want to suggest that where that comes from is, I'm going to say often, but I feel the word is more likely to be invariably, but I'm not going to be that bold. I'm going to play it safe and I'm going to say often. I think that where this comes from often It's a mistaking, I'm going to call it cause and effect for the purposes of this conversation. In other words, when the person collapses, when this is seen through, and this is seen for what it is, nothing arising as everything. Although there are no rules, there are some commonalities. It's quite likely that the individual for whom that has happened, let's say, it's quite likely that they will experience less neurotic energy. Because we're talking about an energetic shift here. We're not talking about a shift in belief or a shift in thinking. We're talking about an energetic shift. So it's quite likely there'll be less neurotic energy. It's quite likely that there will be a quieter way of being in the mind, pretending that there is such a thing as a mind, for this conversation. That's quite likely. It's quite likely that there'll be maybe fewer thoughts, quieter thoughts, more space in which there may be no thought at all. All of that, none of that's necessary, but all of that is quite likely. So for the purposes of the kind of the story that we're exploring here, we could say, well, that's the effect. The cause is the sudden explosion out of separation into oneness. You could say, well, that's the cause, and the effect is maybe a quieter mind, maybe less neurosis, maybe less agonised feelings. Often feelings might be stronger, but then work through much more quickly, for example. So I think a lot of the stuff about practices, where we set up a workshop to kind of teach this stuff, arises out of a kind of, it's almost like a natural reversal of cause and effect, where the mind goes, I mean, let's put it this way. Let's say I'm on a spiritual search and I'm walking through the Himalayas and I come across a clearing, and in this clearing there is someone, sitting there. And there's something about them that I feel quite attracted to. I go and sit with them, and I rather like being in their presence, and I get the sense that, they have a quietness about them, a quiet energy about them. There isn't a lot of neurosis going on there. They seem to have a quiet mind. When I talk to them, they report that they have a quiet mind. You see, well, it's quite natural for me to go, I want what he's got, or I want what she's got. And he or she seems to have a quiet mind, not much neurosis. So what I need to do is to quieten my mind and maybe push away my neurosis, I don't know. Let's stick with the quietening of the mind. What I need to do is to quieten my mind, and then I'll be like them, and I'll have what they've got. But I'm getting it the wrong way round, you see. I'm saying, well, if I quieten my mind...
It's imitating.
Is it imitating? It's sort of imitating the outcome, as it were. So if I make my mind quiet, I'll have what they've got. But they didn't get what they've got by quietening their mind. Their mind's quiet because they saw through the self. We don't see through the self by quietening the mind. But if the self is seen through, the mind will probably become quieter. So that's what I mean by we can kind of, in conventional speak, what we're talking about is we can kind of mistake cause and effect. When I hear somebody like Eckhart Tolle, for example, it always puzzles me in a way, because there is the suggestion of, well, this is something that we can do which will be useful in terms of what we're talking about. Be in the now. Quieten the mind, be in the now. But if you listen to or read what happened biographically for Eckhart Tolle, that's not what happened. What happened was, as I understand it, he was in a state of profound long-term depression. which became nearly suicidal, and then there was a sudden awakening. So to me, the logic of that, if I was kind of a teacher, which I'm not, but if I was a teacher, I think, well, the logic of that is what we need to teach people, is to go into a state of long and profound and near suicidal depression. And that might lead to awakening.
Is that though not in some way?
Can I just add, you see, I mean, it's perfectly natural. We come across whatever, the one who seems to us to be the guru, they have this energy, we want to be near them or whatever. It is quite natural for us, and often we may do this, to imitate them in whatever way we can. If they're a vegetarian, that means becoming a vegetarian. If they only eat yogurt, that means only eating yogurt. If they're celibate, that means becoming celibate. If they wear robes, that means wearing robes. If that means living in the Himalayas, that means living in the Himalayas for us. It's perfectly natural for the one who is seeking to think in this way. I want to be like you, so I am going to adopt all the things about you that I can. But the trouble is, the only thing about you that's relevant is that you're not there, and I can't adopt that. So I interrupted you.
Yeah, so this sort of dropping away then of the person. You don't think being with people like that somehow brings that about?
It's unknowable. It's unknowable. If you want to look at the evidence is absolutely clear. I mean, take any characteristic, it doesn't matter, any action, but let's say sort of sitting with a holy one, sitting with a guru, whatever. The evidence is absolutely clear, isn't it? Some people sit with the guru and the self disappears. Some people sit with the guru and the self doesn't disappear. Some people don't sit with the guru and the self disappears. Some people don't sit with the guru and the self doesn't disappear. I mean, it is absolutely clear, that, isn't it? So the evidence is clear. We make of that whatever we want to make. But what I would add to that is, and let's relax about it. It doesn't matter, because if there is an impulse to sit with the guru, then sitting with the guru may well occur. It won't definitely occur, but may well occur. If there's no impulse to sit with the guru, sitting with the guru probably won't occur. But it may occur. Maybe you're very attracted to a beautiful girl who goes off to sit with the guru, so you go off to sit with the guru as well for that reason. So, whether the impulse is there, if the impulse is there, it will probably happen, but maybe it won't. If the impulse isn't there, it probably won't happen, but maybe it will. And in either case, the self may be seen through, or the self may not be seen through. And the mind will do with that whatever it does. The mind is a bit of a monkey, and it's very good at making up stories. And the mind will make up whatever story about that it makes up. Whatever story the mind makes up about that will be nonsense, and it doesn't matter. Isn't that wonderful? It doesn't matter. None of that matters. We can't get it wrong. We can't get it right either, but we can't get it wrong. But of course, if we could get it, I mean, it's great that we can't get it wrong. Of course, if we could get it right, that would be awful, because that would be so not relaxing. Because if we could get it right, and we knew that, we'd have to try awfully, awfully hard to get it right. So where's the relaxation going to be? We can't get it right. We can't get it wrong. What happens, happens. Sitting with the guru happens or it doesn't. Drinking beer in a bar in Berlin happens or it doesn't. Seeing through the self happens or it doesn't. Well, it will.
What about grace?
I like the term, but it's a kind of story, isn't it? Somebody said something earlier about what about this, and I was going to say, well, I like that, but it is a story. Like, you know, is this fate? Is it chance? Is it da-da-da-da-da-da? I mean, it's all story. Of all the stories, that's probably the one I like the most, that it's grace. Somehow it's grace. But that is a story in itself. If we just keep it very simply to that, well, it's grace. I mean, because when everything's grace, this glass of water is grace. So because everything's grace. So yes, it's grace. It's lovely. If we just keep it really simple like that, it's still a story. The problem with that story is like every other story. I've said, you know, it's a monkey, isn't it? The mind is a monkey. The mind loves complexity. It's how it keeps in control. The mind wants to be in control. The mind wants to think it's running the show. I am running the show. One of the easiest ways to do that is to make things really difficult, to keep things really complex, because when things are seen as simple, then we can see through the mind. If the mind can keep the story really complicated, it keeps the mind in control. So the thing about grace, it's a story upon which we can build a much more complicated story which will keep the mind in control. And the most obvious next step is, if it's grace, well, what's the obvious next step? If it's grace, I have to earn it. I'm not saying everybody goes to that point. Some people, it's grace and there's a relaxation into this. But for many of us, particularly if we're strivers, that's a kind of obvious next step. And then we're off onto a story which is just like all the other stories. It's like the antithesis of the possibility of relaxation. I mean, if I am an evangelical Christian whose purpose on the planet is to save as many heathens for God as possible, how can I ever relax? Every moment of relaxation is a betrayal of God. Every moment I stay in bed is a moment I could be saving souls for God. So these stories are not very relaxing. The grace story, it doesn't have to become like this, but it's so easy for it to. It's okay, it's grace, I have to earn grace. And I mean, I've read this so many times, and some beautiful spiritual books, they're beautiful, but it doesn't mean that maybe it might not be a good idea to take them to the charity bookshop. Grace, but you have to play your part. The universe, or God, or spirit, or energy, or whatever you want to call it, or oneness, it's there with grace for us. We have to play our part. We have to open ourselves up to it. And so we can be off on another path and another story, which is actually a hamster wheel. The path is we seem to be on a path that leads from here to there, but of course it doesn't really, because it's not really a path, it's a wheel. So we're running around the wheel, which again can be very tiring. It doesn't kind of encourage relaxation. So up to a point, I think it's a beautiful story, and then beyond that point, it can become another. I mean, many of us have quite a masochistic impulse, and it can become another stick to beat ourselves with, another reason to hit ourselves over the head. I'm not opening myself up to grace enough. I need to do more. I need to become more pure. Maybe if I just kind of cut lentils out of my diet and only ate carrots, maybe I could open myself up more. That's the problem with it for me. I mentioned ego before. It's a word, it's such a weasel word, ego. For those of us who are here tomorrow, maybe we'll talk about that more. It's used in so many different ways that get confused, but so much we can get, so much. This is about losing our ego. And then we think, okay, I have to become egoless. That means I must become less selfish. So I've got to work on myself so I don't have ego anymore. And that can become such a stick that I can beat myself up with. Another way to beat myself up. I'm not egoless enough. I took the largest croissant at breakfast and I shouldn't have done that. I should have let my friend take the largest croissant at breakfast, but I didn't, so I haven't yet learnt to be without ego. And again, I want to suggest, this is one of the games that the mind plays to keep itself in control. The mind will do anything not to be unseated. Again, this is why there is so much shock And sometimes so much laughter, often, not always, but often, if this is suddenly seen through. If this is suddenly seen through, that sort of realisation that the mind that always was in control never had any power and didn't actually even exist, but maybe that's a place we should go to tomorrow, the non-existence of the mind. For now, because we're quite short of time, let's just speak conventionally as if there is a mind, in which case one of the things we can say about it absolutely is it wants to be in control. It wants to be the managing director of our life. The mind sees itself, we could say, as sitting behind a huge important desk, pulling levers and pushing buttons and making things happen. I pull a lever here, something happens out there. I push a button here in my desk, something happens out there. I am the chief executive officer of this wonderful piece of architecture called my life. And part of the shock and part of the possible laughter is that if this is suddenly seen through, one of the realisations is all those levers and all those buttons. I've been sitting there pushing these levers and pulling these levers and pushing these buttons year after endless year, in control, making things happen. And you know what? Not one of them was wired up. Not one of those levers did anything. Not one of those buttons did anything. They're all just fakes. And that's why there can be so much laughter and shock. Do you know the metaphor of the dream bus? Who's driving the dream? There's a film about this called Who's Driving the Dream Bus? At the fairground as a child, you might have gone to this, you might remember this. You go to the fairground as a child and you're put on a little train or a little bus and you have a wheel and you turn the wheel and then the train goes round, the bus goes round and you turn it this way, you turn it that way, you turn it. You're driving the bus, you're steering the bus, you steer it this way, it goes this way. Of course the train or the bus is on tracks. Nothing that you're doing with the steering wheel is having any effect whatsoever. That is a really good metaphor for our life. We think we're driving our life. We think we're driving the dream bus. There's no one driving the dream bus. There's no one pulling levers that are attached to anything. There's no one pushing buttons that make anything happen. It's just a great big dream or story. It's the dream story. But it's the story that the mind loves because it keeps it in control. So, in a way, all of these stories of self-improvement, I'm not against, there's nothing wrong with self-improvement, except it can become very masochistic. So these stories of self-improvement, I must become less egotistical, I must become less selfish, I must give that larger croissant to my friend, not keep it for myself, not maybe cut a little bit off and nibble it quietly in the kitchen before my friend sees it so she doesn't realise it was the larger croissant. That's kind of all this scheming that mind does. And the pulling of the levers and the pushing of the buttons to make things happen and the purifying of the ego. It's such hard work, but it keeps the mind in control. That's its purpose. The mind doesn't care how much hard work it is. The mind doesn't care how much we stress ourselves out with trying to purify the ego. It doesn't matter to the mind because it keeps the mind in control, which is where it needs to be. So that was a bit of a long answer to a simple question. But yes, it is grace. If you ignore all that, it is grace. It's all grace. Of course it is. Every feeling, every thought, every perception is grace.
If you speak, it sounds so easy. Just wake up suddenly. But many religions or gurus give us this picture of we have to meet our death, like Jesus on the cross. So this is, maybe it's not so deep what you speak about.
Well, firstly, I just want...
Inside from the mind of oneness, but is it really from the heart? This is what I asked me.
Well, firstly, I am not saying what you first said. I'm not saying just wake up.
Okay, what's my interpretation?
I don't see anyone there who can wake up. I don't see anyone there. Waking up happens. Waking up happens. So I'm not saying just wake up. But yes, you're right. And again, I'd say for the same reason I've just been talking about, because the mind loves these stories. And the more extreme they are, and the more dramatic, and the more noble, and the more sacred they are, the more the mind loves them. So yes, you can go on YouTube tonight when you get home, and you can tune into a particular guru, and I'm not going to name, and he will say that to get this you have to want this more than life itself. Well, how are you going to do that? Did he do that? If he did that, why is he not dead? Or another one will say, to have this, you have to be prepared to give up everything. How are you going to do that? And the next time you're in a hall like that with this particular guru, I think you should ask him, did you do that? How did you do it? How did you show that you wanted enlightenment more than life itself? The evidence of you sitting before me breathing seems to suggest that you didn't want it more than life itself. And there are beautiful, noble stories in the literature of this which absolutely encourage this kind of thinking and feeling. And again, I want to suggest, I don't want to be too simplistic about it, but I mean, it is a short evening and we're nearly at the end of it, and we can be more, maybe we can be more sophisticated tomorrow, and we can certainly eat more biscuits tomorrow. But so, I keep coming back to this point. You may think I'm flogging it a bit, but I do think it's really, really important. I want to just that what this is about. I'm not saying this is entirely what it's about. It's about other things as well, like we have a psychological love of drama. We have a psychological love of exciting stories. You tell me that I'm on a path in which I have to want enlightenment more than life itself, and the romantic part of me will really feel fed by that if I have a certain kind of personality. So I'm not suggesting that what I'm about to say explains all of it, explains a great deal of it. All of these stories, every single one of them, does the same thing that I've just been talking about. It keeps the mind in control. It keeps the mind in control. Okay, now I know what I have to do. The mind wants to know what it has to do so it can get on with doing it. Okay, now I know what I have to do. I have to want this more than life itself. Now let me set about doing it. And now I have a task and a path, and I'm happy. The only problem with that is that as long as I feel myself on a path, separate, looking for unity, there is no possibility of unity being seen. No possibility at all. And that's kind of, I'm not saying anything particularly profound there. I hope, I'm just saying something which I hope is kind of, again, in the realm of the obvious. As long as this is looking, there cannot be finding. By definition, there cannot be finding, because if there's finding, looking stops. So as long as this, in a way, that's all I'm saying. As long as there is seeking, there's no suggestion here that we stop seeking, because we can't stop seeking. If seeking is happening, it's happening. Just as if drinking tea is happening, it's happening. So that, this isn't. Don't think I'm saying, it's wrong to seek. We shouldn't seek. No, seeking's lovely. It's wonderful. It's very exciting, very colourful sometimes. It's a great way of passing what seems to be time. It's much better than watching some soap opera on the television. Seeking is much more exciting and colourful and romantic and fulfilling and enriching and all of this stuff. But as long as we're seeking, there cannot be finding. That's not a profound thing to say. It's just kind of an obvious thing to say. It's like, it might sound a bit banal if I kind of give this as a metaphor. If I've lost my car keys and I'm looking for my car keys and there they are on the table and I see them in front of my eyes and I pick them up, then I can't be looking for my car keys, can I? I can only be looking for my car keys if I don't know where they are. If I found my car keys, I can't be looking for them. So I'm not saying really anything more profound than that. As long as I am spiritually seeking, I'm using my words very carefully. I'm not being a bit pedantic. as long as I could be saying, as long as I'm spiritually seeking, I cannot be finding, which kind of, in a way, is clearer, but in a way is misleading, because I can never find this. So I'm just being a bit kind of pedantic. As long as I am seeking, there cannot be finding. When finding happens, seeking has to stop.
So how to drop the seeking? How to drop the seeking?
How to stop the
To
drop the seeking. The seeking ends when it ends. Now, on the one hand, I know how frustrating that can sound. And believe me, I can remember when I heard that and found it very frustrating. So on the one hand, I understand how frustrating that can sound. But on the other hand, I know that heard in a different way or in a different spirit, it can be relaxing. And relaxation is the key to Buddhahood right here, right now. Now, whether it's heard as with a sense of frustration or with a sense of relief, I don't know, but it could be one or the other. And again, we're coming to the end of this evening. I've been given the time signal now, but if maybe tomorrow we might go into this. If we had more time, we'd go into this now. What I haven't talked about is, perhaps I shouldn't throw this in now, but I will. What I haven't talked about is hope and despair. But I'll just throw this in very quickly, that despair is much closer to what we're talking about here than hope is. Because despair is much closer to what we're talking about here than hope is, because in despair there is at least the possibility of some relaxation. Hope keeps us at work. In hope there is always something more to do. Yes, just maybe this is the last one and we'll finish.
Isn't it seeking without seeking?
What's seeking without seeking?
You just said finding happens when seeking stops.
No, I said it the other way round. I said seeking stops when finding happens. A very important distinction. Because if I said finding happens when seeking stops, then I've immediately created a path and some workshops, and maybe some workshops would make a lot of money, who knows. The workshop would be about the workshop would be that we've got something we can teach there. If we could find a way to stop seeking, now we have a path which will produce finding. I said it the other way around. It's the other way around. If finding happens, then seeking automatically stops. We can't stop seeking. If the energy of seeking is there, we can't stop it.
Okay, does it mean anything?
We can pretend that it's not there. Or we can pretend that we're relaxing, or we can turn it into a different direction. But if the energy of seeking is there, it's there. One last thing, then we really need to stop. Yeah.
Does it mean anything to you, seeking without seeking?
No.
Okay.
But if we had more time, maybe we could unpick it. I have come across phrases. Like I've come across somebody who sent me a book they wanted me to endorse, and in the introduction to the book, or the back cover, it said that the book contained detailed instructions for a practiceless practice. Well, that's another of these seemingly paradoxical phrases that you come across, a practiceless practice. There's no such thing as a practiceless practice. A practice is a practice. A practiceless practice is still a practice.
Like walking less walking, or walking without walking. Doesn't make sense to you.
Well, there can be someone walking and there can be no one walking, which in a sense, that's a good place to end this, because that is the essence of what we're talking about. I referred earlier to there can be somebody cycling down a country lane and then suddenly there's no one cycling down a country lane, yet cycling down a country lane is still happening. There can be someone walking and then there can be just walking. And that is all we're talking about. That's a good place to stop. Okay, thank you.